Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here, your quiet companion for another evening of reason and reflection. Tell me, where are you settled tonight? Is there lamplight nearby? Perhaps the faint scratch of rain against glass, or the particular stillness that comes when the house has grown calm, and thought moves more freely. These are the hours Watson returned to most faithfully in his notes. Not the dramatic hours, but the still ones. Truth surfaces like ink through paper. Tonight we follow him into a snowbound Yorkshire hall, where old silence has grown heavier than it should. Careful observation must do what 20 years of secrecy could not undo. Do subscribe to Watson's Margins, so no case goes unread. Now, settle in. For as the greatest observer of his age understood, one must learn to see what is there, not merely what one expects to find. You'll find the Watson's Margins Spotify channel linked in the description below. I do hope you'll join us there as well. Chapter 1. The Snow at Blackmere Hall. It is a curious feature of my long association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes that the most singular of our investigations were so frequently ushered in not by the dramatic arrival of some agitated client, nor by the sharp ring of our Baker Street bell in the small hours, but rather by a single letter delivered with the morning post, unassuming in its exterior and devastating in its implications. So it was on a bitter Thursday morning in the third week of January, during one of the coldest winters I have known in England, that a cream-coloured envelope bearing a wax seal arrived at our rooms in Baker Street, and set in motion a chain of events which I have hesitated until now to commit fully to paper. I had called upon Holmes that morning to find him in tolerably good spirits, which is to say he had not yet taken to his violin at the impossible hour, nor was he engaged in any of those chemical experiments which left the atmosphere of our sitting-room unbreathable for days together. He sat in his armchair beside the fire, long fingers steepled beneath his chin, regarding the grey morning sky with the contemplative stillness of a man whose mind is anything but idle. Mrs. Hudson had set the breakfast things, and I was attending a cup of tea to my second tea when he reached across to the salver and lifted the envelope with 2 fingers, though assessing its weight before breaking the seal. He read it in silence. Then he read it again, when he set it down upon the knee of his mouse-coloured dressing gown. There was a faint quickening about the eyes which I had come to recognise over many years as the outward sign of genuine interest. "Watson," said he, "are you presently encumbered by patients who cannot spare you for several days?" "My practice has been quiet these past weeks," I admitted. "The cold keeps people indoors." "Then you will come with me to Yorkshire." He handed me the letter before I could frame a question. The hand was educated and careful, the ink dark and deliberate, as though each sentence had been composed with particular attention to precision. The writer identified himself as Sir Julian Harbury, master of Blackmere Hall, a house situated upon the Yorkshire moors to the north-east of the market town of Ardale. He wrote that he found himself in possession of information suggesting that an official document pertaining to an inquest conducted some 20 years previously had been improperly altered before filing, and that certain members of his household had since behaved in a manner which he could only describe as intolerable. He requested Holmes's immediate attendance, noting with understandable anxiety that the matter could not safely be entrusted to correspondence. "A buried inquest report," said Holmes, who had been watching my face as I read with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose conclusions are already formed. "You observe the seal, Watson. I examined it. The impression was a small shield bearing 3 ravens above, a motto I could not quite make out, pressed unevenly into dark green wax. An old device, I ventured. The pressure is uneven, as though the writer's hand trembled, or the seal itself is worn from long use. Both, I fancy. Sir Julian is elderly, and the seal has served the Harbury family for a considerable time. Note also the postmark. The letter was sent 4 days ago. He has hesitated before writing, which suggests a man who is frightened but methodical. Holmes rose abruptly and moved towards the mantelpiece. We leave on the midday train. The journey north occupied the better part of the afternoon and early evening. Holmes spoke little, as was his habit when a case had engaged him, but stared out at the retreating countryside with that concentrated blankness of expression which I knew concealed the most active workings of his intelligence. By the time we approached Yorkshire, the sky had closed altogether. Thin snow had begun to fall across the moorland, with a persistence that boded ill for the roads beyond Ardale station. At Ardale we were met by Thomas Grigg, the Blackmere Hall groundskeeper, broad and weathered man of 60 or thereabouts, who handled the horses with the easy authority of one who has spent his life among animals and open country. He was not a talkative man. To Holmes's inquiry about the state of the roads he replied that they were passable when we set out. He could not speak, for what another hour of snowfall might accomplish. His tone was flat and steady, but I observed his eyes moving once toward Holmes with an expression I could not immediately interpret, somewhere between wariness and relief. The drive from the station to Blackmere Hall took rather more than an hour through deepening snow. The moors offered no shelter, and the wind had risen to carry the flakes horizontally past the carriage lamps, so that the world beyond our immediate circle of light was reduced to a featureless and rather oppressive darkness. By the time we turned through the gateposts and drew up before the entrance of the hall, clear that the storm had settled in with a seriousness that would not be easily dismissed. Blackmere Hall was large, without being grand. Frost, of the sort of ancient, unself-conscious house, which has been added to across several centuries without great architectural ambition, and which communicates not elegance but solidity. Its stone walls were the colour of the moorland itself, dark and wet in the lamplight. Several windows glowed with the warm amber of firelight. In different circumstances it might have appeared welcoming. Sir Julian Harbury met us in the hall, and I confess that the sight of him somewhat revised the impression I had formed from his letter. He was perhaps 70, slight and white-haired, with the careful movements of a man in whom some old nervous disorder has been quietly at work. His eyes, however, were bright and quick, and he shook Holmes's hand with a warmth which told of genuine relief at our arrival. "You have come, Mr. Holmes. I confess I feared the storm might turn you back." His voice was educated and pleasantly modulated, with only the faintest tremor in it. "Storms have never answered to my convenience," said Holmes pleasantly, "and the inconvenience is generally instructive. We were shown to our rooms to refresh ourselves before dinner, and it was during this brief interval that I had occasion to observe the other members of the household who were assembled in the drawing-room when we came down. Dr. Lionel Ames, the family physician, was a compact and careful man of late middle age, whose manners were impeccably courteous, and whose eyes were rather too still for a man who had nothing to conceal. Major Cedric Vale retired carried the indefinable uprightness of the career soldier into civilian life with a faint air of effort, as though the habit of command had not entirely reconciled itself to ordinary domestic existence. Mr. Edgar Fenwick, the solicitor, thin and exacting, in his dress, with the professionally agreeable manner of a man accustomed to smoothing difficulties before they become disputes. The two remaining members of the company were of a different character. Evelyn Harbury, Sir Julian's niece, was a composed young woman of perhaps 30, whose intelligence was apparent in the quality of her attention to whatever was being said, and whose composure struck me even then as something maintained rather than natural. Mrs. Brierly, the housekeeper, governed the domestic arrangements, with the silent efficiency of one who regards disorder as a personal affront, moved through the rooms with a severity that discouraged an idleness in others by its very presence. Dinner was conducted with a degree of social courtesy which I can only describe as effortful. Conversation ranged across safe topics, the weather, relative merits of various country houses known to members of the party, a recent review of some antiquarian interest to Sir Julian. Holmes said very little, a circumstance which the others appeared to find more unsettling than his most direct questions might have done. It was only twice that the surface of politeness showed the strain beneath it. On the first occasion, Major Vale had begun some observation concerning the age of the hall's oldest wing, when the words 20 years ago passed his lips in a quite incidental construction, and there was a pause of perhaps 2 seconds, perfectly still, in which no fewer than 3 people refrained from looking at one another. On the second occasion, Dr. Ames inquired after the condition of the upper rooms, with a solicitude that seemed, on reflection, somewhat excessive for a man with no professional reason to concern himself with the domestic arrangements. Holmes heard it all. I knew from the particular quality of his stillness at table that not a word, not a hesitation, not a glance exchanged across the soup had escaped his attention, though he gave no outward sign of anything beyond polite interest. Later that night, the storm pressed itself against the windows of our respective rooms, and the old house settled and creaked about us. I lay awake for some time listening. Once, perhaps an hour after the household had retired, I heard a soft and measured tread in the passage above, and then silence. Whether it was the ordinary restlessness of an old building in high wind, or something less innocent, I could not determine. In the morning, I thought, I would mention it to Holmes. As it happened, the morning brought matters of considerably greater urgency to our attention. Chapter 2. The Forgotten Proceedings. I slept badly, as one often does in an unfamiliar house during a storm, and rose early to find the world beyond my window transformed. The moors had disappeared entirely beneath a uniform whiteness, and the snow continued to fall with a quiet relentlessness that rendered the idea of departure not merely inconvenient, but impossible, bleak. The lane through which we had arrived the previous evening was indistinguishable from the fields on either side of it. Blackmere Hall was, to all practical purposes, an island. Holmes was already dressed when I knocked at his door, standing at the window with his pipe, studying the drifts below, with an expression of mild professional satisfaction. "The storm obliges us," he remarked without turning. "Whatever is concealed within these walls cannot now be removed until the road's clear, and whoever is anxious to conceal it must act under our observation. You heard the footstep last night, I suppose?" I was about to mention it. Upper passage, north side, between approximately 11:30 and midnight. I heard it also. Measured, deliberate, tread of someone who knew the boards well enough to choose where to place their weight. He turned from the window. "Come, Sir Julian has sent word that he wishes to speak with us before the others are about." We found the old man in his study, book-lined room at the rear of the house, smelling of coal smoke and old paper, where a fire had been laid, but not yet properly caught. Sir Julian sat behind a broad desk, with the particular stillness of a man who has not slept. He looked older by daylight than he had appeared at dinner, and the brightness I had noticed in his eyes the previous evening had given way to something wearier and less certain. "Forgive the hour, Mr. Holmes." He gestured towards the 2 chairs set before the desk. "Confess, I have found sleep difficult these past several nights. Since the discovery in the attic, in fact." Holmes settled himself and crossed his long legs with perfect ease. "Tell me precisely what you found, Sir Julian, and precisely where. Begin at the beginning, and omit nothing, however trivial it appears to you." The old man gathered himself. Witnesses often do, when a sympathetic but precise question puts them back at the beginning of their anxiety. He explained that some 3 weeks previously he had undertaken to catalogue the contents of a sealed attic room, task long deferred. Following the death of his solicitor of 30 years, an elderly gentleman, a Hardraby who had managed the Harbury papers, with close personal knowledge of their arrangement, Faust, among boxes of correspondence and bound estate accounts, Sir Julian had come upon a leather folio, old and cracked at the spine, which he had taken at first for household records of no particular consequence. Post. Inside he had found what appeared to be preparatory notes and draft testimony related to the inquest conducted in the winter of 1874 into the death of his elder brother, Sir Alister Harbury, who had drowned in the quarry pond on the eastern edge of the Blackmere estate. The official verdict after 2 days of proceedings at Ardale had been accidental death. Sir Julian had accepted that verdict for 20 years, with sorrow, but without serious question. The draft materials in the folio, however, told a different story. Certain passages in what appeared to be a preliminary version of witness testimony contained discrepancies that did not appear in the filed report. Most significantly, a careful notation in the margin of one page, in a hand he did not recognize, indicated that the stated time of death had been altered between the preliminary hearing and the official proceedings. "Quarter of an hour's difference," said Sir Julian. He seemed to find some importance in the exactness of the figure. "It may sound trivial, Mr. Holmes. I confess I could not immediately see why it should matter. But the hand that made that notation was clearly troubled by it. Why mark it at all?" "And the original filed report," Holmes said. "Where is it?" "That is precisely the point. It is not among these papers. The official inquest record, which ought to have been retained here, after the family obtained a copy, is absent. It was absent, I now believe, before I began the catalogue. Someone removed it, Mr. Holmes, and I cannot say when." Holmes was quiet for a moment. Then, "Oh, you mentioned in your letter that you had found footprints beneath the attic window, despite fresh snow outside, showing no approach." Sir Julian nodded with the emphasis of a man who has been waiting for this precise question. He had discovered the prints the morning before our arrival. The snow beneath the attic's single exterior window bore the clear impression of booted feet, but the unbroken surface of the drift beyond showed no track leading either to or from that point. He had mentioned the discovery to no one in the household. Yet, within the hour of finding it, he had noted a change in the manner of at least 2 of his guests, a new watchfulness, an over-careful social ease, though someone had been informed. Holmes made no comment upon this. He asked, instead, how long the household had been assembled at Blackmere Hall, and Sir Julian explained that he had invited the company some 10 days previously, ostensibly to celebrate the new year, though, in truth, he had wanted those with a connection to the old events under the same roof while he reviewed the papers. Fenwick had drawn up the Harbury legal affairs for the last 15 years. Vale had known the family since his regimental days with Sir Alister. Dr. Ames had attended the household as physician since shortly before Sir Alister's death. "And your niece?" Holmes inquired. Shade passed across the old man's face. "Evelyn is Sir Alister's daughter. She was 10 years old when her father died. She knows only what the inquest reported, and I would prefer for the present that it remain so." He paused. "She is a perceptive young woman, Mr. Holmes. I am not certain how long that preference will be honoured." We took our leave shortly before the rest of the household began to stir. Holmes spent the better part of the following hour in a close inspection of the attic staircase and the locked room beyond it, while I waited in the passage with a candle. He said nothing during this examination, which I had learned to interpret as the sign, not of absence of findings, but of their quantity. A man who discovers nothing says so promptly. A man who discovers a great deal takes time to arrange it. At breakfast, the company assembled with the morning's social machinery restored. Major Vale spoke of the weather with the brisk authority of a man accustomed to worse conditions in worse places. Fenwick unfolded a newspaper he must have brought with him from London, since nothing so recent could have reached the hall by post, and attended to it with the methodical care of a man who handles every document the same way, smoothing each page at the corner before turning it, his fingertips moving with unconscious precision. I happened to be watching Dr. Ames as Holmes quietly inquired of Mrs. Brierly whether the attic rooms were habitually kept locked. It was a casual enough question addressed to a tangential figure over the butter dish, hopes. But Ames set down his cup a half-second before completing the gesture of raising it, and then continued as though nothing had occurred. It was the smallest possible disruption, visible only to someone attending for exactly that kind of response. Later, we stood together in the corridor outside the library. Holmes spoke low, and without turning his head in the way he had when he wished a remark to reach only one pair of ears. Three people in that room are engaged in the management of information this morning. Not one of them is performing the task for the same reason as the others. He moved towards the window and gazed out at the immovable white landscape. Sir Julian found his papers, and someone knows it. The question which will govern everything that follows, Watson, is a simple one. I waited. "Question is," said Holmes, "whether the person who removed that filed report did so 20 years ago to conceal a crime, or last week to conceal the concealment." He straightened and tucked his hands into his pockets with an air of private satisfaction. The distinction is not merely academic. It determines which of our company is afraid of justice, and which is afraid of one another. That night, the storm continued its indifferent work upon the moors. Holmes and I heard the movement in the upper passage again. Closer this time, followed at once by the unmistakable sound of something hard and solid meeting the floor above our heads, and then nothing more. Holmes was at my door within 30 seconds, candle in hand and his grey eyes alight with that concentrated calm which in another man would have been called excitement. "Now," said he quite softly, "we shall see what the night has been preparing for us." Chapter 3. The Locked Archive Room. We took the stairs at pace. Holmes holding the candle low, and to one side so that its light caught the treads without blinding us to what lay above. Of course, the upper passage was cold, with a stillness that felt different from the ordinary chill of an unheated corridor, though the air itself had recently been disturbed and had not yet settled. Holmes moved without sound. I am not a heavy man, but beside him, in such moments, I have always been conscious of my own comparative clumsiness. The door to the archive room stood open. I say open, fractionally would be more precise. It stood perhaps 3 inches ajar, and through the gap came a faint current of yet colder air. Beyond that, silence of a quality that I have encountered only in circumstances I would rather not dwell upon. Holmes pushed the door back with 2 fingers and raised the candle. Sir Julian Harbury lay upon the floor beside the central reading table, on his side, one arm folded beneath him and the other extended across the boards. A dark contusion was already visible above his left temple, and a short glass-fronted cabinet behind him had shed 2 of its shelves, which lay among scattered papers and a quantity of fine grey dust. A chair belonging to the reading table had fallen away at an angle that struck me, even in that first moment, as oddly wrong, though I could not have said precisely why. I crossed to him at once. His breathing was present, shallow but regular, and his pulse, while slow, steady. The blow had been hard enough to render him insensible, but had not, I judged, driven the bone. I sent Holmes for water and blankets without looking up, and by the time the old man had been made as comfortable as circumstances permitted, and I had confirmed that no further injury was present, the household had arrived in various stages of undress and alarm, drawn by the noise of our movement through the passage. Fenwick came first, then Vale with a lamp, then Evelyn Harbury took in the scene with a single rapid assessment, and went directly to her uncle's side without a word of agitation. Dr. Ames arrived last of the guests, and it was he who relieved me of the immediate medical attendance, which I yielded with professional courtesy while moving to stand beside Holmes at the room's threshold. Holmes had not, I noticed, gone to Sir Julian at all. He stood just inside the doorway, with the candle held at arm's length, his gaze moving slowly across the room from left to right with the unhurried patience of a man reading a text in an unfamiliar hand. I watched him rather than the room, knowing by long experience that his eyes would find in 30 seconds what mine might miss in 30 minutes. "Window," I said quietly, because I had noticed it. The single sash was closed and latched. Deep ledge outside bore an inch of undisturbed snow. No entry had been made from without. "Yes," said Holmes without inflection. "Then whoever struck him was already inside. Or the door was not locked from within at all. And what we have been given to understand about the room's condition is itself part of the arrangement." He lowered the candle until it was level with the floor near the threshold. I looked where he directed my attention and saw it. Small but distinct pool of meltwater on the boards just inside the door, not spread as water spreads. When it is tracked in by a boot, gathered in a rough. Oval, as though something wet had been set down there and lifted again. By the time a weak and grudging dawn had established itself beyond the windows, Sir Julian had been carried to his room and declared by Ames to be in no immediate danger, and the household had assembled in the drawing-room in the particular state of agitation that follows. A shock, when shock must be contained by social form. Holmes declined to join them. He spent an hour in the archive room alone, and when he emerged and came to find me in the corridor, his expression had the quality of a man who has confirmed a suspicion he had hoped to be wrong about. "The leather folio," he said. "It is gone. I had half expected it. Taken during the night. Taken before Sir Julian was struck, I think. The folio's impression is still clear in the dust of the lower shelf. But there is no disturbance in the material around it that would suggest a search. Whoever took it knew precisely where it was." He paused. "And the cabinet, Watson. Look at those shelves again when you have the opportunity. They did not fall. They were lifted from their brackets and placed, and the papers scattered over them afterward to suggest violence, to simulate a struggle. To simulate the particular kind of struggle that produces a convincing scene of disorder without requiring one to have been present for any great length of time." He moved to the window at the end of the passage and stood there a moment. "The door is the interesting thing. Everyone in the house will tell you and will genuinely believe that the archive room was locked from within, and yet—" He said nothing further on the subject at that moment, which I recognised as deliberate. Holmes withheld his intermediate conclusions not from theatricality, though he was not above that quality, but because a half-formed chain of reasoning shared too early invites others to complete it along the wrong lines. He would speak when the evidence warranted the speech. What I had observed for myself, however, I set down in my own mind with some care. The meltwater near the threshold was wrong in its shape and placement for a boot print. The overturned chair lay at an angle that placed it behind Sir Julian's body rather than beside it, which is not where a chair falls when a man is struck and staggers forward. The dust on the upper cabinet was undisturbed across the whole surface except for a narrow, clean line along the far edge. The width, I estimated, finger drawn carefully across it, and the window, with its perfect ledge of untouched snow, had been conspicuously available for our attention from the first moment, as though someone had wished to ensure we found it impressive. At mid-morning, Holmes asked me to accompany him on a brief inspection of the exterior of the house, a suggestion which the continuing snowfall made rather less pleasant than it sounds. We worked our way along the north face of the building to the point below the archive window, and stood there in the cold, looking down at the surface of the drift beneath the sill. The prints were unmistakable. A booted foot, average in size, pressed itself into the snow, at intervals consistent with a man approaching the wall from the open moorland beyond. They led directly to the point below the window, and no further. Holmes crouched beside them for a long time. Wenged, fart. Then he produced a small rule from his pocket and measured 3 of the impressions in quick succession, comparing the depth at toe and heel. When he stood, he brushed the snow from his knees with the brisk efficiency of a man concluding an experiment. "You perceive the problem," he said again. "The prints simply begin. There is no trail leading to them from across the moor. That is one problem, yes. There are 2 others. First, observe the depth at the toe of each print relative to the heel. Man walking presses the ball of his foot more firmly into soft ground as his weight transfers forward. These impressions are uniform throughout, toe and heel, depressed to precisely the same degree, as though the boot was pressed into the snow by a downward force rather than a natural stride. He straightened. The second, the window ledge above us. An inch of snow, unbroken. Had a man truly climbed through that window in the night, he must have disturbed it. He did not, because no man climbed through it. Then the prints were made here deliberately, I said. Planted to suggest an intruder from outside. Just so. And the person who planted them understood the moors well enough. to choose a direction from which an approach might credibly have been made, and to do so in darkness and in falling snow. He turned back towards the house with his coat drawn close. There is only one member of this household who answers that description. Without difficulty, Watson paused. I thought of Grigg's flat eyes and his hands easy on the reins in the blizzard, of the look he had given Holmes at the station, somewhere between wariness and relief, and I believed I understood Holmes's meaning. What I did not yet understand, as we re-entered the warmth of Blackmere Hall, was why a man would manufacture evidence of an intruder, and then remain present to be found out. Puzzle, I suspected, would prove as instructive as the evidence itself. Chapter 4. Footprints that began indoors. Thomas Grigg was found in the stable yard. An hour after our return from the exterior examination, tending to the horses, with the same unhurried competence he had shown on the drive from Ardale. The storm had eased slightly, enough to make the yard passable, and he was moving between the stalls with a lantern and a bucket, speaking quietly to the animals in the way of a man for whom that particular companionship has long been preferred to the human variety. He did not seem surprised when Holmes appeared in the stable doorway with his hands in his coat pockets and his grey eyes attentive. "I shall not keep you long from your work," Holmes said pleasantly. "I want only to ask you about last evening, and I want you to be precise." Grigg set his bucket down and looked at Holmes with an expression I had seen before in men of his type. Not the wariness of guilt, exactly, but the careful steadiness of someone who has decided in advance how much to give and is gauging the moment to give it. He was perhaps 62 or 3, with the kind of face that moorland weather carves over decades into something angular and difficult to read. "I was in my room above the coach-house from 9 o'clock, he said. "I heard nothing out of the ordinary until the movement in the main building, which would have been yourselves going up. And before 9 o'clock, a pause, fractional but present. I walked the north perimeter at dusk. I do so most evenings when the weather permits." "The north perimeter," Holmes repeated, the particular tone he employs when repeating a phrase he intends to examine. "You passed, then? Beneath the windows of the archive room. I may have done." "You did, Mr. Grigg. The pattern of your boot is distinctive, the left heel worn more heavily on the outer edge, and the same wear appears in the snow beneath that window, in prints which I have just now measured and found to have been pressed into the surface, rather than walked into it." Holmes paused to allow that to settle. "I am not yet asking who directed you to make them. I am asking whether you made them." The silence in the stable stretched, long enough that one of the horses shifted its weight and blew softly. Then Grigg picked up his bucket again, but with the air of a man who finds it easier to speak while his hands are occupied. "I made them," he said. Holmes received this without any alteration of expression. "And Sir Alister Harbury, you knew him well," was not framed as a question, and Grigg did not treat it as one. What followed was less a confession than a measured and reluctant account, offered in the flat tone of a man who has rehearsed it many times in private, and finds the public version strangely inadequate. He had entered service at Blackmere Hall as a young man when Sir Alister was in his 20s. He had run errands of the sort that a trusted outdoor servant runs for a gentleman who is not entirely at peace with certain members of his own household, carrying notes, maintaining silences, performing small services that required discretion rather than intelligence. Had admired Sir Alister in the uncomplicated way of a young man who finds in an employer the qualities he recognises as worth admiring, and the death at the quarry pond had been, in its way, the formative event of his life. He denied, clearly and without particular emphasis, any involvement in the assault upon Sir Julian. He denied having entered the archive room at any point. He had made the footprints. Yes, the request of another, whose name he declined to provide. That a suggestion of outside interference would prevent further scrutiny of the household. He had believed, or had chosen to believe, that the matter concerned old papers and old business that was better left disturbed. Holmes thanked him, and we withdrew. Walking back across the yard, I turned the account over and found that it satisfied neither well nor poorly, which is often the condition of a true statement that has been trimmed at the edges. "He is protecting someone," I said. "Evidently," and that someone had sufficient influence over him to make the request and sufficient knowledge of the household's geography to know that the footprints beneath that specific window would be discovered and remarked upon. Holmes glanced up at the main building. "The question is whether the footprints were intended to mislead an investigation or to mislead another member of the household. I had not considered the second possibility, and said so. We are not necessarily the primary audience for every piece of staging we encounter," Holmes replied, and said nothing more on the subject until after luncheon. Sir Julian was resting and largely lucid by mid-afternoon, the contusion on his temple an angry purple but his mind clear. I sat with him for 20 minutes, while Holmes spoke with Fenwick in the library, Fost, and the old man used the time to tell me something he had omitted from his earlier account, whether from oversight or a lingering instinct toward protection. I could not be certain. Sir Alister had quarrelled with 2 members of his household in the weeks before his death. One quarrel concerned money, specifically a series of financial transactions connected to the estate that Sir Alister had begun to question. The other was of a personal nature. Sir Julian declined to elaborate, saying only that his brother had possessed the family stubbornness in full measure, and had not been a man who arrived at suspicion easily or abandoned it once formed. "He told me," said Sir Julian from his pillows, "that he had found something he had not been meant to find. Those were his precise words. I was young and did not press him as I ought to have done. 3 weeks later he was dead. I relayed this to Holmes that evening. He listened without interrupting, which with him is the fullest form of attention. The drown, I said. The outline is becoming rather clearer. The outline, yes, but an outline without verified measurements is a hypothesis, and I do not act upon hypotheses, Goss. He was standing at the mantelpiece in our shared sitting room, which Mrs. Brierly had assigned to us for the duration of our stay, and he turned to face me with a directness that indicated he was ready to share something. I have been examining the clocks. I must have allowed some expression of bewilderment to show, because he continued with the faint patience of a teacher who has anticipated the confusion of a capable student. Blackmere Hall has 9 clocks of varying age and accuracy. When the main long-case clock in the entrance hall stopped during the storm 3 days before our arrival, the household began to rely upon individual timepieces. I have compared them this afternoon. They disagree with one another, by amounts ranging from 4 minutes to 22. Mrs. Brierly's mantel clock, which she regards as authoritative, runs 11 minutes fast. Major Vale's pocket watch, by which he noted the time of retiring last night, runs 7 minutes slow. Holmes placed his fingertips together. The result is that No two members of this household can agree with precision upon when anything occurred during the night of Sir Julian's assault. The window of uncertainty is very nearly 45 minutes. Surely that benefits whoever struck him, I said. It benefits whoever arranged for that uncertainty to exist. He moved to the window and looked out at the dark moors, where the snow had finally, tentatively, begun to slow. A stopped clock is a very convenient thing, Watson, when one anticipates that the timing of events will require scrutiny. Considerably more convenient than a running one. The implication settled over me with the particular chill of a realization that arrives later than it should. You think the long case clock was stopped deliberately? Holmes turned from the window. His expression was that of a man who has declined to confirm a conclusion, not because he doubts it, because the moment for confirmation has not yet arrived. I think, he said carefully, that a great deal of what appears accidental in this house will prove, on examination, to have been arranged. And I think the person who arranged it has had 20 years to consider which details matter and which do not. He reached for his pipe from the mantelpiece. Tomorrow I shall speak with each of them individually. Not to challenge their accounts, you understand. Merely to listen to how they tell them. Outside the storm was at last beginning to exhaust itself. The silence that followed the wind was in its way more unsettling than the noise had been. In that silence, somewhere within the walls of Blackmere Hall, someone was also listening and calculating, and waiting to see what Sherlock Holmes would do next. I found the thought considerably less comforting than the fire. Chapter 5. Faces at the corridor window. Holmes conducted his interviews the following morning in the small parlour adjoining the library, a room whose principal virtue, from his perspective, was that its single window looked out upon the interior courtyard rather than the moors, leaving whoever sat in the chair opposite him, with nothing to contemplate but the room itself. And the man before them was not present for most of these conversations. Holmes preferred to work alone in such circumstances once, and I had long since learned that the role he occasionally assigned me, that of visible companion whose very ordinariness put people at their ease, was most useful when he directed it. That morning he did not, which told me he expected his subjects to be guarded enough that any additional presence would close rather than open them. I occupied myself with Sir Julian, who was sitting up and eating breakfast in his room with the cautious appetite of a man in whom the body's brilliance is somewhat ahead of the mind's, and the mind's recovery. He spoke of his brother at greater length than he had the previous afternoon, with the discursive warmth of old grief that has passed through bitterness and arrived eventually at something more habitable. Sir Alister had been 12 years his senior, more a figure of admiration than a companion in the ordinary sense. Formidably intelligent and, his later years, increasingly preoccupied by matters he did not share with his younger brother. Sir Julian had assumed, in the way of a much younger sibling, that these preoccupations were simply the natural gravity of an adult life. He had not yet reached himself. "I have sometimes wondered," said Sir Julian, setting down his cup with the slow care of a man whose head still pained him, "whether I failed him by not asking more. Whether he would have told me, had I pressed. There is a particular form of grief that wears the shape of self-reproach, and it is almost never accurate." I told him so, gently as the sentiment warranted, and left him to rest. In the corridor below, I encountered Major Vale, who was returning from the direction of the parlour with the particular composure of a man who has just acquitted himself adequately in a situation he would have preferred to avoid. He was upright and self-contained as always, but I noticed, as he paused to exchange a civil word about the improving weather, that his eyes moved once to the mirror at the corridor's turn before settling back on me. It was not a furtive glance. It was habitual, the quick peripheral check of a man accustomed for many years to situations in which an awareness of what approaches from behind is more than a social courtesy. In a military context, such a habit is unremarkable. At Blackmere Hall, in the present circumstances, it had acquired a different quality. Holmes emerged from the parlour shortly before 11, poured himself a cup of the cold coffee that had been standing on the library table since breakfast, drank it without apparent objection, while I waited. "Fenwick first," he said, setting the cup down. "He moistens his fingertips when he is preparing to handle documents. You have noticed this. He did it 4 times during our conversation, were no documents present. The gesture has become disassociated from its original purpose, which tells us that his anxiety regarding paperwork is not situational, but chronic. It has been with him for some time. He knows what the documents contain. He knows considerably more than that. When I mentioned the marginal notation in the inquest draft, the handwriting that Sir Julian did not recognise, Fenwick's response was to ask, with genuine precision, whether I had estimated the date of the annotation from the quality of the ink. Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Now, Watson, what?" Why should a man ask whether the age of a marginal note had been assessed, unless he knew who had written it, and was calculating whether its authorship could be established? I followed the logic without difficulty. He wrote it himself. That is my present conjecture. The annotation was not made by a concerned observer recording an anomaly in someone else's work. It was made by the man who altered the document, noting the change for his own reference, as solicitors are professionally inclined to do, and then forgot or failed to remove it before the folio was filed away. Holmes moved to the window. The irony is rather fine. His own professional habit created the very evidence he has spent 20 years hoping no one would find. "And Ames?" Holmes was quiet for a moment, and in that moment I read something that was not quite reluctance, but was adjacent to it. "Doctor, Ames is a more complicated figure than his surface suggests. He answered every question directly, which in itself is not remarkable. His directness had a quality I can only describe as prepared. He did not hesitate because he had anticipated the questions and arranged his answers in advance." A brief pause. "Evelyn Harbury watches him whenever the subject of her father arises. I had thought this was suspicion. I am no longer certain it is." I turned this over. "Gratitude, perhaps? If Ames protected her mother from scandal after the death..." Holmes inclined his head slightly, which, with him, is the nearest approach to acknowledging that another person has contributed something of value to his thinking. "It would explain the quality of her attention. Not surveillance, but a kind of anxious acknowledgement." The afternoon brought a development I had not anticipated. I had gone to the library to write up my notes while the light lasted, and had been there perhaps an hour, when, looking up at a sound from the corridor, saw through the glass panels beside the door 2 figures in the winter garden beyond the far window. The winter garden was a narrow glassed passage along the house's southern face, used in warmer months for plants, and, evidently, the present circumstances, for conversations that its occupants did not wish to conduct indoors. Evelyn Harbury and Major Vale stood close together in the manner of people engaged in something more urgent than social exchange. I could not hear them through 2 thicknesses of glass and the width of the corridor, but I could observe, and what I observed was this. Evelyn spoke at some length with her hands still and her eyes fixed on Vale's face, in the way of someone delivering information they have considered or before deciding to deliver. Vale listened without his usual composed authority. Whatever she was telling him diminished him in some way that was visible even at that distance, not in posture but in expression, as though a structure he had maintained by long habit was being quietly loaded beyond its tolerance. He said something brief in return. She shook her head. He looked away toward the snow beyond the glass, and when he looked back, his face had resolved into something I can only describe as the expression of a man accepting a condition he cannot alter. I told Holmes that evening, describing what I had seen as precisely as I was able. He listened, with his fingers pressed together and his eyes on the middle distance. "She knows something of the original events," he said, when I had finished. Not everything, I think, but enough to have reached conclusions of her own, and she has now communicated some portion of those conclusions to Vale." He rose and moved to the fireplace, standing with one arm along the mantelpiece, in the attitude of concentrated thought. The difficulty is that whatever she said to him has altered his position without, so far as I can determine, altering his intentions. He will not confess voluntarily. He is the kind of man who regards confession as a form of defeat rather than an obligation. Then, how do you propose to move him? By allowing events to present him with a situation in which silence becomes more costly than speech. He glanced across at me with that particular expression of his, direct and faintly luminous, which I associate with the moments when his thinking has progressed further than his conversation. "I spent 2 hours in the cellar passages this evening, while you were at dinner. I had wondered at his absence, and had attributed it to one of his habitual solitary investigations. And the servants' passage connects the main cellar to a secondary stair that exits into the north corridor, 12 feet from the archive room door. It is low and unpleasant, and has not been used regularly for some years, but it has been used recently. Within the last week, I should say." He straightened. "There is your locked room, Watson. Not locked from within at all. Entered and exited by a route that no one thought to consider, because no one knew to look for it." He said it without triumph, in the level tone of a man reporting an observed fact, went to bed shortly afterward, leaving me to sit alone with the fire and the steady accumulation of what we now knew, arranged against the larger shape of what we did not yet know, and the growing certainty that the two were shortly to meet. Chapter 6. The Silent Compact. There is a particular quality to a house in which secrets have been kept for a very long time. It is not dramatic, does not announce itself. It is rather a kind of atmospheric pressure, faint but persistent, the sense that ordinary conversations are being conducted slightly above a subterranean current, whose nature no one in the room will openly acknowledge. I had felt it at Blackmere Hall from our first evening, and by the morning of our 4th day it had become pronounced enough that even Mrs. Brierly, who carried herself with the resolute imperviousness of someone constitutionally opposed to atmosphere, through the rooms with a shade more deliberation than her usual brisk authority. Holmes came to breakfast in good spirits, which I had learned over the years to regard as a sign not of progress toward resolution, but of the particular intellectual pleasure he took in a problem that had revealed its full complexity. A simple case afforded him no more satisfaction than a simple meal, the density of the thing that engaged him. He ate well and said very little until the table had been cleared, at which point he set down his coffee cup, turned to me directly, and delivered himself of the summary I had been expecting since the previous evening. We have at present 3 people concealing information from one another while maintaining the appearance of a unified social surface, he said. Fenwick knows what the documents contain, and has known it for 20 years because he shaped their contents. Ames knows what occurred at the quarry pond, and has carried that knowledge as a private burden since the night of Sir Alister's death. Vale knows both these things, and knows additionally that Fenwick and Ames are aware that he knows creates a triangle of mutual silence in which each party's security depends upon the continued discretion of the others. He paused. These arrangements are stable until they are disturbed. Sir Julian's discovery disturbed it. And Evelyn? Holmes considered for a moment. Evelyn occupies a different position. She is not. She has arrived at partial knowledge through her own intelligence, years, in the way that a perceptive person slowly assembles a picture from details that were never intended to form one. He rose from the table. She is, in some respects, the most dangerous person in this house. Not because she intends harm, because she is no longer willing to remain ignorant, and the others have not yet understood that. We spent the earlier part of the morning in what Holmes described as a structural examination of the servants' wing, a phrase which covered practice, a careful survey of every accessible passage, cupboard, and connecting stair in the north half of the building. Mrs. Brierly regarded this activity with unconcealed disapproval, but did not impede it, which I attributed less to deference than to a calculation that refusal would appear more irregular than compliance. It was Holmes who found the coal scuttle in an abandoned section of servants' corridor between the old laundry and a room that had apparently once housed a still and now housed nothing but dust and cold air. The scuttle stood against the far wall with its lid in place, which was itself unremarkable. But Holmes went to it directly, with the particular purposefulness of a man who has been looking for exactly this object in approximately this location. Inside, beneath a shallow layer of coal dust that had been disturbed and imperfectly replaced, lay a leather folio, aged and cracked at the spine, which I recognised from Sir Julian's description as the papers recovered from the attic. Holmes lifted it with both hands and carried it to the window, where the thin winter light was marginally better, and opened it across his forearm, quiet for nearly 2 minutes. The pages he examined were dense with handwriting. Some passages struck through, annotated in the margins in 2 distinct hands. He turned each leaf with the concentrated attention of a reader for whom every word is also a clue to the words surrounding it. "Several pages missing," he said at last. "Torn at the binding, not cut, and not recently. The edges are too discoloured for a recent removal." He closed the folio and stood holding it with a thoughtful expression. Someone extracted those pages before the folio was hidden here. The question is whether they were removed 20 years ago, or within the last week, and the answer to that question depends on whether this is the folio's original hiding place, or a secondary one. You believe it was moved here, from somewhere else. The coal dust on the lid had been brushed inward from the edges, rather than settled naturally. Something that was placed here recently, by someone working quickly and without good light. He turned toward the door. Folio was not taken from the archive room to destroy it. It was taken to be consulted, then hidden here until it could be removed from the house. The storm has made that impossible, which means the person who hid it is still present and rather more anxious than they appear. At luncheon, Holmes placed the recovered folio on the table without comment or explanation, setting it beside the bread basket, with the casual air of a man depositing an unimportant item. The effect on the room was immediate and illuminating. Fenwick's gaze went to it for precisely half a second before moving away to the window. But the deliberateness of that redirection was more revealing than a prolonged look would have been. Ames became very attentive to the serving of his soup. Vale sat with a stillness that was, paradoxically, the most active form of stillness I have observed. The absolute physical control of a man suppressing a strong impulse by main effort of will. Lynn looked at the folio, then at Holmes with a directness that acknowledged without speaking what she understood him to be communicating. Mrs. Brierly served the meal with her customary impassivity, and if she registered the tension in the room, she gave no indication that it differed from the domestic norm. In the afternoon, while Holmes sat in the library with the folio and a magnifying glass, and what appeared to be a sheet of his own writing on which he was conducting a comparison of hands, I walked in the grounds, which the partial lifting of the storm had made briefly accessible. The thaw was tentative and uneven, patches of the moorland visible through the thinning snow. In the way that the landscape of a submerged thing appears through clearing water, was on the east path. Within sight of the frozen quarry pond, perhaps 300 yards across the frost-stiffened grass, when I heard steps behind me and turned to find Evelyn Harbury in a dark coat and carrying no gloves, toward me with the purpose of someone who has decided to do a thing before the decision can be reconsidered. She came directly to the matter. "You have found the folio," she said. "Not a question. Mr. Holmes found it, yes." She looked out toward the quarry pond for a moment. Profile. She had the quality of a person who has grown so accustomed to composure that it has ceased to require effort and has become instead a kind of landscape feature, simply the shape of her face in repose. "My father did not slip," she said quietly. "I have believed that since I was 19 years old. I have had no proof, only the particular arithmetic of remembered details that resolve, when you arrange them honestly, into a different sum than the one you were given." She turned back to me. "Does Mr. Holmes know what happened to him?" "He is forming a view," I said carefully. "He will not speak until the evidence warrants speaking." She nodded, as though this answer confirmed something she had expected. "Dr. Ames," she said, and then stopped, began again with a slight revision of emphasis. "Dr. Ames was kind to my mother in the years after my father's death, whatever his part in the rest of it. I want you to understand that I know that." I said that I would convey her meaning to Holmes. She thanked me, and walked back toward the house, without any of the hesitancy or visible relief of a person who has unburdened themselves. Had the manner, rather, of someone completing a necessary task in a sequence of several, and moving to the next. I stood by the frozen quarry pond for some time after she had gone, looking at its surface, white and opaque beneath its covering of snow, and thinking about what lay beneath surfaces that had appeared smooth and settled for 20 years, and about the particular patience required to wait that long for truth without being certain it would ever arrive. Holmes heard my account of the exchange that evening with his eyes half closed and his fingers pressed together at the tips. "She has been waiting longer than any of them," he said when I had finished. "And she is the only one of the principals who wants the truth for its own sake, rather than for what it conceals or protects." Quiet for a moment. "That makes her testimony, when the time comes, the most valuable in the room. Outside, The storm had retreated to the north, and the first stars in 2 days were visible above the moors. By morning, the roads might once again be passable. Whatever conclusion this affair was approaching, it was approaching it now. Chapter 7. The Groundskeeper's Confession. The morning broke with a clarity that felt almost aggressive. After so many days of enclosed grey, the sky a hard, pale blue above the moors, and the snow bright enough to make one squint at the windows. With the storm's retreat had come something else, perceptible shift in the quality of the household's collective anxiety. As though the walls themselves had exhaled, conversations at breakfast were fractionally longer, the silences fractionally less weighted. Even Mrs. Brierly permitted herself a remark about the improving conditions that fell just short of warmth. Holmes observed all of this from his customary position of apparent inattention, and said nothing until the table had cleared. "And we were alone, today," he said simply, folding his napkin, and that single word carried the quiet finality of a man who has assembled his material and identified the moment for its arrangement. He did not, however, begin where I expected him to. Thomas Grigg was found in the kitchen garden at mid-morning, clearing the worst of the snow from the paths. With a steadiness that suggested a man who finds physical labour a more reliable companion than thought. He looked up when Holmes approached along the cleared path, and the look he gave him was different from the wary assessment of their first exchange in the stable. There was in it now a quality of resolution, the expression of a man who has spent several sleepless nights reaching a decision, and has arrived, at last, at the far side of it. Holmes had barely settled himself on the low stone wall at the garden's edge before Grigg set down his spade and spoke without preamble. "I have not told you everything," he said. "I know it," Holmes replied, neither reproach nor particular surprise. What followed occupied the better part of an hour. I shall set it down here as faithfully as I recorded it. In my notes that evening, Grigg's manner of telling it was nothing like my ordered prose. He spoke in the halting, compressed way of a man for whom the events being described have never fully lost their original weight, though 20 years of carrying them had not diminished them, but merely made the carrying habitual. He had been present at the quarry pond on the night Sir Alister died. Not present at the moment of the death itself, he was at some distance, returning across the eastern field from an errand he declined to specify, but present near enough to observe the aftermath. He had seen 2 men at the pond's edge, one kneeling, one standing, in the posture of people who have just witnessed something that has altered the nature of the evening irrevocably. One of those men he identified as Dr. Ames. The other was Major Cedric Vale. The ice at the quarry pond had been thin. That winter everyone on the estate had known it, and Sir Alister had known it too, which made his presence there after dark, alone, a matter that had struck Grigg at the time as requiring explanation. Sir Alister had not been a careless man about the land. He knew every frozen pond and treacherous ditch on the Blackmere acres as well as any man, live. Grigg had not come forward at the inquest. He had been young, employed, and conscious of a power differential that makes honest testimony feel, to those on its wrong side, very much like a form of self-destruction. He had told himself that what he had seen was ambiguous. The 2 figures at the water's edge might have been attempting rescue rather than contemplating concealment. That his eyes in the dark distance could not be trusted. He had repeated these arguments to himself for 2 decades, with the diminishing conviction of a man who knows they are not arguments but excuses. Recently, within the past month, he had been approached by one of the household's guests and asked to perform the service with the footprints. He had been assured that the matter concerned old papers only, that the purpose was to deflect inquiry from the family before it could cause unnecessary distress to Sir Julian, that no harm would come to anyone. He had complied, partly from old loyalty, and partly, he admitted without self-flattery, from the remnant of a self-protective instinct that 20 years had not entirely extinguished. He did not name the person who had approached him, but he looked once toward the main building in a way that was not ambiguous. Holmes thanked him without ceremony and rose from the wall. We walked back toward the house in silence for some moments before Holmes spoke. But you notice he describes the archive room's interior with considerable particularity, he said quietly. The position of the shelves, the disposition of the papers on the floor, the precise location of Sir Julian's body. He could have seen the room afterward, I said, post, in the general confusion of the household's arrival on the scene. He could have, but the details he offers are of the room as it was found, before the light was properly established. The candles were not fully lit until several minutes after the first alarm. Man standing in the passage would have had a very limited view. Holmes paused at the terrace steps. He also describes the fallen cabinet as being against the south wall. It was against the east wall, Watson. I measured the room. Everyone who viewed the scene by good morning light will have formed an impression of the east wall, because the cabinet was visible from the door. Grigg's error is precisely the error of a man who heard the room described, rather than saw it himself. I stopped walking. Then his account of the assault is not first-hand. He is reporting what he was told, accurately in the main, but imperfectly in the detail. Second-hand accounts always are. Holmes turned to face me on the steps, and there was, in his expression, the particular quality that appears when a chain of reasoning has reached a link he finds significant, which means whoever struck Sir Julian told Grigg about it afterward, and Grigg, for reasons of his own, has now elected to offer himself as the responsible party. He paused. A man does not falsely confess to assaulting an elderly gentleman without a compelling reason. The question is whether he is protecting someone from loyalty or from fear. Or from guilt, I said. If he believes his silence at the original inquest made everything that followed possible. Holmes considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Yes, he said quietly, that is possible, and it speaks rather well of him. We found the drawing room in a state of suspended animation when we returned indoors. Vale sat with a book he was not reading. Fenwick occupied himself with correspondence, whose urgency struck me as somewhat performed. Ames stood at the window with his back to the room, looking out at the brightening moors with the stillness of a man who has run out of positions and is simply waiting. Holmes moved through the room without stopping, pausing only to mention, in the easy conversational tone he employed, when he wished a remark to do the work of a much longer statement, that the roads from Ardale would very likely be passable by morning, and that he had taken the liberty of sending Grigg with a message to the town, requesting that a constable attend the hall at the earliest convenience. The response to this announcement was instructive. Vale set his book face down across the arm of his chair with a precisely controlled movement, and looked at Holmes with an expression I can only describe as the face of a man confirming a calculation that had not resolved in his favour. Fenwick's pen stopped moving. Ames turned from the window. It was Evelyn, seated apart from the others with her hands in her lap, who spoke first. Then it will be resolved, she said to no one in particular, the tone of someone completing a sentence that has been interrupted for 20 years. Holmes made no direct reply to any of them, continued to the door, and then turned one hand on the frame with a mildness of expression that I recognized as its own form of precision. "I should perhaps mention," he said, "that the confession Mr. Grigg offered this morning is not one I am able to accept. His account contains at least 3 material inaccuracies, which preclude his having participated in the events of 2 nights ago. Someone has been good enough to provide him with a narrative, and he has done his loyal best with it." He allowed a moment's silence. "Whoever composed that narrative will understand that its inadequacies have been noted." He left the room. I followed, and did not look back, though I heard, clearly, the small involuntary sound that one person in that room made in the silence after the door closed. Could not have said with certainty whose voice it was, but I had my opinion. Chapter 8. The Missing Page. I have observed the many years of my association with Sherlock Holmes that a case which appears to be approaching its resolution has a peculiar tendency to produce, at precisely that moment, one final complication designed to arrest the momentum of inquiry and redirect it along a false bearing. Holmes himself had remarked upon this phenomenon more than once, always with the same dry observation that the human instinct for self-preservation is at its most inventive when it is most desperate, and that the last deception in any affair is invariably the most carefully considered. I thought of this the following morning when Fenwick appeared in the library doorway with a volume of sermons in his hand, and an expression of carefully modulated significance upon his face. He had found, he said, something which he believed Mr. Holmes ought to see. The volume was a thick octavo edition, bound in faded green cloth, from a shelf in the lower tier of the library's east wall, where the theological, devotional works had been arranged with the systematic neglect of books that are quite out of social obligation and thereafter undisturbed. Fenwick had gone to the library that morning. "Oh," he explained, because he often found reading a comfort under difficult circumstances, and had reached for this particular volume without particular purpose. And it had opened in his hands to reveal a folded sheet of paper, pressed flat, within the pages, as a man might press a flower, preserved there, apparently, for a considerable period. He handed it to Holmes with the precise care of a man transferring a fragile object. Holmes received it with the precise care of a man who does not intend to let his handling of an object betray his thoughts about it. I read it over Holmes's shoulder. It was a single page of close handwriting, the same period hand as the other folio documents, dense with official phrasing and the particular formality of legal record. It appeared to be the concluding page of a deposition, and its substance was simple enough. The deponent, identified as Dr. Lionel Ames, attested that he had arrived at the Quarry Pond within minutes of hearing a cry from the direction of the water, had found Sir Alister Harbury in the water at the pond's edge, had made every effort to effect a recovery, and concluded upon examination that death had occurred as a result of drowning subsequent to an accidental fall upon weakened ice. The final sentences described the condition of the ice and the position of the body with a clinical precision that was, in its way, more persuasive than any amount of elaboration. The household assembled over the course of the next quarter hour, drawn by the intelligence that something had been discovered, and stood or sat about the library with the collective attention of people who have been waiting for a concluding document, and have now been presented with one. Host. Ames read the page when Holmes passed it to him and surrendered it again without visible emotion, though a certain quality of tension left his jaw and shoulders as he read, in the manner of a man receiving confirmation of something he had almost ceased to trust. Vale read it with the held breath of a man diffusing a mechanism, and released that breath fractionally when he reached the end. Sir Julian, who had come downstairs for the first time since his injury, with the careful deliberateness of a man who has been told to rest and has overruled the instruction, read it slowly and folded it across his knee with the air of someone who has received simultaneously more and less than he hoped for. "It appears to confirm the original verdict," he said, looking at Holmes. "Alistair fell. It was an accident." There was in his voice neither relief nor disappointment, but a kind of exhausted uncertainty, tone of a man who has pursued a question for so long that the answer, when it comes, does not immediately feel like one. Holmes said nothing. He had taken the page back from Sir Julian and was holding it at the angle that admits the best quality of natural light, with his glass in his other hand, examining its surface with a concentration so complete that the rest of the room might have ceased to exist for the purpose it served him. The silence extended until it became uncomfortable, and then continued somewhat beyond that. "Mr. Holmes," said Fenwick, with the controlled patience of a man exercising it with some effort. "It settles several things," was replied without looking up, "though not precisely the things you might suppose." He lowered the glass and set the page on the library table, smoothing it flat with the back of his hand. Then he straightened and clasped his hands behind him, and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way. He had, when the final configuration of a problem had assembled itself in his mind, and he was confirming its geometry before committing to it. "Tell me, Watson, when we arrived at Blackmere Hall, what was the condition of the archive room?" The apparent irrelevance of the question caused a brief confusion among the assembled company, which was, I suspected, its purpose. I answered it as precisely as I could. Cold. The fire had not been laid for some time. The temperature was barely above freezing. Yes, corridor outside. Similar, perhaps slightly less cold, being a more central passage. And the library in which we now stand? Warmer. Fire is kept regularly here. Quite so. Holmes turned back to the table and indicated the page with a gesture that invited our collective tension, without directing it toward anything specific. This document purports to have lain undisturbed between the pages of that volume for a considerable period. Decades, if we are to believe that it was placed there at or near the time of the original inquiry. He paused. Candle was burning in this room last night, after the household retired. Mrs. Brierly mentioned it this morning, as a matter of mild domestic complaint, believing someone had forgotten to extinguish it. She found it burned down on the reading table at approximately this end of the room. Nobody spoke. Candle soot in a heated room deposits itself differently from soot formed in a cold one. The carbon particles settle more broadly in warmth, more narrowly in cold, owing to the differing air currents produced by a flame in each condition. The soot marks on the upper edge of this page fold, allowed the exposed portion to receive deposit from a candle burning nearby, are broad and warm room in character. He let that land before continuing. Had this page rested in a cold archive room or in a cold corridor for 20 years, been transferred to a warm library? Only, this morning, the soot deposit would exhibit different characteristics entirely. It was not deposited over decades. It was deposited last night, in this room, while a candle burned on that table, sat here, forging a document which they intended to produce this morning as a discovery. Quality of silence that followed this statement was different from any that had preceded it in the investigation. Crowds. It had the particular of a silence in which several people are simultaneously revising their understanding of events, and in which at least one person is understanding, for the first time, that the intelligence arranged against them is of a different order from anything they had prepared for. I watched their faces as carefully as was able. Ames had gone quite still, with the stillness of a man who has just recognised that what he believed to be his protection is in fact an additional charge against him. Fenwick was looking at the page on the table with the expression of an architect observing the collapse of a structure he designed. Vale had composed his features into something that was almost military blankness, almost but not entirely. It was Evelyn who spoke, and she spoke with a quietness that was more arresting than any volume would have been. "Then it is not over," she said. "No," said Holmes, with equal quietness. "It is not over. It is, however, nearly so." He gathered the forged page from the table and held it with the same two-fingered care with which he had handled Sir Julian's letter at Baker Street, in what felt now like a different world, and addressed the room with that yarn with the measured directness of a man who has completed his preparation and is ready to proceed. "I should ask you all to remain available this evening. I shall have some things to say, which will require your collective presence, first, and it will be better for everyone concerned to hear them together rather than separately." He moved toward the door with the unhurried certainty of a man on whose side time has conclusively arranged itself. "In the meantime, I have one small experiment to conduct. Watson, I shall need a lantern, a pair of wet boots, and the use of the servant's stair for approximately 40 minutes. He offered no further explanation, and I had the experience, familiar from a great many such investigations, of understanding that explanation would come when it was ready, and that pressing for it would yield nothing except a raised eyebrow and a remark about the virtues of patience. The lantern I could locate without difficulty. The wet boots required rather more ingenuity, and I will confess that the precise purpose of the experiment remained opaque to me, until the following evening, when Holmes demonstrated its results to a room that had run entirely out of its capacity for concealment. Chapter 9. Holmes reconstructs the night. The gathering Holmes had requested took place the following evening in the drawing-room, which Mrs. Brierly had prepared with the meticulous neutrality she brought to all domestic arrangements, as though the room's purpose were a matter of complete indifference to her. The fire was well established, the lamps were lit, and the chairs had been arranged with sufficient space between them, that each person sat in slight isolation from the others, which I suspected was not an accident of housekeeping, but a deliberate configuration, either Holmes's instruction or Mrs. Brierly's own assessment of what the evening would require. Sir Julian occupied the chair nearest the fire, bruised temple still dark against his pale complexion, his hands resting on his knees with the particular stillness of a man who has resolved to hear whatever is coming without preparation. Evelyn sat beside him, close enough to be useful if required, with her characteristic composure intact, and her eyes on Holmes from the moment he entered the room. Ames had chosen a chair slightly withdrawn from the central group, which I noted and believed Holmes noted also. Fenwick sat with his hands flat on his thighs, his professionally ordered expression applied with visible effort. Vale was upright, in the chair furthest from the door, in the attitude of a man who has selected his position with care and intends to hold it. Holmes stood at the fireplace, not leaning against it, in the attitude of a man who is comfortable, but standing with a measured ease that contained, beneath it, the same quality of controlled tension I had observed in him in courtrooms, when he was about to deliver testimony that would not be comfortable for everyone present to hear. He began, as he always did in these moments, not with the conclusion, but with the foundation. 20 years ago, he said, Sir Alister Harbury discovered that 2 men in his circle of trust had been conducting a scheme of financial fraud against the Blackmere estate. Incompletely but sufficiently. In the draft materials from the folio, and in the marginal annotations which Mr. Fenwick made in the careful professional habit of a man who records what he alters. Principal parties to that fraud were Mr. Edgar Fenwick, who had the legal access to structure it, and Major Cedric Vale, who had the personal relationship with Sir Alister necessary to divert his scrutiny at critical moments. Neither man spoke. Holmes continued without pausing for their response. Sir Alister confronted them. Precise circumstances of that confrontation I cannot establish beyond question. But the evidence of the ground, testimony of witnesses, both voluntary and involuntary, and the internal logic of what followed, are consistent with a meeting at the Quarry Pond, after dark, in the 3rd week of January, in the winter of 1874. During that meeting, we were in anger, or in the desperation of a man who sees exposure before him, Major Vale struck Sir Alister with sufficient force to cause him to fall upon the thin ice at the water's edge. The ice gave way. Sir Alister did not come up again. He paused, and in the pause I heard Evelyn draw one controlled breath through her nose. Sir Julian's hands, which had been still on his knees, tightened very slightly. Dr. Ames arrived within minutes. He was a young physician at the time, newly in the household's employment, and what he found at the pond's edge, in a position for which his training had not prepared him. Immediately that the death had not been accidental in the ordinary sense. He understood also that the woman he had come to greatly respect, Sir Alister's wife and Evelyn's mother, of a constitution that would not survive a public scandal of the magnitude which a truthful inquest would produce. He made a choice that I will not call easy, because it was not, and whose consequences he has lived with in the manner of a man who has never fully made his peace with it. Ames had lowered his head. He did not raise it. The inquest proceeded on false foundations. The timeline was adjusted, in the original draft testimony, by a quarter of an hour, enough to place Vale and Fenwick at a remove from the pond at the relevant period. The adjustment was recorded in Fenwick's marginal hand, because he could not, even in the service of concealment, entirely suppresses his solicitor's compulsion to annotate what he amended. Page bearing that annotation was not destroyed because the folio was sealed and filed before anyone thought to look for it again. Holmes turned from the fireplace and addressed the room with the same deliberate evenness, moving now from the past into the present. When Sir Julian discovered the folio, the compact of 20 years was endangered. Someone in this household, person who learned of the discovery very soon after it occurred, decided that the threat must be managed. Folio was to be removed from the archive. Sir Julian was to be incapacitated before he could communicate its contents to me, and the scene was to be arranged to suggest an intruder from outside. misdirecting investigation toward an external party who could not easily be identified or apprehended. He moved to the side table and lifted the lantern he had placed there before the company assembled. My experiment of yesterday evening established two things. The first concerned the servant's stare. A man carrying a lantern, wearing boots packed with snow, to produce meltwater of the precise character I found inside the archive room threshold, can enter the archive from the cellar passage, cross the room, strike a blow, retrieve an object from a known location, return to the servant's stare in under 4 minutes. The door, I have now confirmed, can be pressed shut from within the passage by a hand inserted through the gap created by the warped lower panel, which has been swollen by winter damp and stands clear of the frame by nearly an inch in cold weather. The lock engages on contact with the plate. From outside the corridor, the room appears secured from within. It is not. Veil had not moved. Posture remained precisely what it had been since the beginning, but something in it had altered in quality, without altering in form, in the way that a wall under structural load looks unchanged until the moment before it does not. The forged deposit, Holmes continued, setting the lantern down, was intended as a final resolution, a document of apparent official standing that would confirm the accidental death verdict and close the inquiry before the constable arrived from Ardale. The soot on its upper edge, as I explained yesterday, establishes that it was composed and prepared in this room last night by candlelight in a heated room. The handwriting, he added, and now he looked directly at Fenwick, is a considered imitation of the period hand in the genuine folio documents, competent in its broad character, and faulty in its specific letter forms, particularly the descenders, which a man cannot easily alter when writing at length, because the muscular habit reasserts itself. It is Mr. Fenwick's hand, dressed in an older costume. Fenwick said nothing. He had the appearance of a man who has discharged the last of his resources, and is simply present now, waiting. It was Vale who spoke. He spoke after a silence of perhaps 30 seconds, in a voice that was level and almost entirely under control. You cannot prove that Alistair did not simply fall. The position of the contusion on Sir Alistair's skull, recorded in Dr. Ames's own preliminary notes before they were revised for the inquest, is inconsistent with a fall from standing. It is consistent with a blow delivered from behind and above, by a right-handed man of above-average height. Holmes met Vale's gaze without any quality of challenge in it, simply with the steady attention of a man who is accustomed to being looked at and finds it unremarkable. "You are right-handed, Major Vale, and you are above average height." Something gave way then, not loudly, not with any of the drama one might expect from the collapse of a structure, maintained by 20 years of effort. Vale set his hands on his knees in a gesture that was almost a mirror of Sir Julian's opening posture, looked at the floor between them, and said, in a voice that had relinquished its military precision, without replacing it with anything else, "I did not intend him to go through the ice." Whether this was true, whether it represented a genuine distinction in a man's mind between what he had meant to do and what he had done, I could not determine, and it was not, in the end, a question for that room. Sir Julian made no sound. Flynn put her hand briefly over her uncle's, and then withdrew it and sat straight. "Thank you," she said to Holmes, and her voice was as quiet and as steady as everything else about her, and contained more within it than I shall attempt to render on the page. Holmes inclined his head once, briefly, in the manner of a man acknowledging a completion rather than accepting a compliment, and moved to the window to look out at the dark moors, leaving the room to absorb, in its own way and at its own pace, the particular weight of what had just been restored to it. Chapter 10. The Passing of the Storm. Constable arrived from Ardale. The following morning, a conscientious young man named Hartley, who rode up the cleared lane with the careful authority of someone who has been told the matter is serious, and is determined to acquit himself accordingly. He was accompanied by a sergeant of considerably more experience, a compact and deliberate man named Fenwick, no relation to the solicitor. First act, on entering the hall, was to assess every person in the entrance vestibule with the quick personal efficiency of a man sorting a problem into its components before applying himself to any of them. Holmes met them in Sir Julian's study and spoke with them for the better part of an hour. I was not present for all of this conversation, but I gathered its substance from what followed. Holmes had prepared a written summary of his findings, set out in the ordered, unembellished prose he employed for official purposes, which contained everything material and nothing superfluous, and which the sergeant read with the sustained attention of a man who recognises in another's work a standard he respects. Major Cedric Vale was taken into custody before luncheon. He made no resistance and offered no further statement beyond what he had said the previous evening in the drawing-room. He dressed with care before accompanying the sergeant to the waiting vehicle, carried himself through the hall, and past the assembled household with the upright of a man who has decided that whatever remains of his dignity will be preserved in his posture if it cannot be preserved in his circumstances. I watched him go with the complicated feeling that Vale had always produced in me a man of genuine qualities, in whom those qualities had been placed entirely in the service of his own continuation, and who had arrived at this morning by the most direct possible route from the evening at the quarry pond 20 years before. Fenwick surrendered himself without ceremony. He had spent the morning with his own papers, organising them into an order that suggested a man putting his professional affairs into a condition fit to be handled by others, puss. And when the constable came for him, he was ready, in the manner of someone who has been ready for a very long time, and is, in an obscure way, relieved that the waiting is over. He spoke briefly to Holmes before departing, in a tone too low for me to hear, and Holmes listened and replied with a single short sentence and an expression I could not fully interpret. I asked him afterward what Fenwick had said. He asked whether the marginal notation would have been found, eventually, by someone, even if Sir Julian had never examined the folio. Holmes looked out at the clearing moors. He wished to know whether it had always been, in the nature of things, inevitable. And what did you tell him? I told him that in my experience, concealed things are proportion to the goose, are found in proportion to the care with which they are looked for, and that the notation would have remained hidden indefinitely, if Sir Julian had not been, at his core, a man who reads what he finds rather than assuming he already knows its contents. He paused briefly. Fenwick found this answer unsatisfying. I suspect he would have preferred either fatalism or contingency, and I was unwilling to offer him either. The question of Dr. Ames occupied the remainder of that morning in a different and more delicate way. Holmes had been precise in his reconstruction about the nature of Ames's involvement, which was that of a man who had arrived at a scene rather than created it, and whose subsequent actions, though morally compromised, had been directed toward the protection of the living rather than the concealment of a crime he had himself committed. The sergeant had listened to this distinction with the careful attention of a man who understood its legal significance, and had, to some consultation with Holmes, declined to take Ames into formal custody, pending further review of the precise circumstances by a senior officer. Ames received this outcome in the drawing room, where Holmes delivered it to him directly. For a moment after Holmes had finished speaking, then he said something which I shall record here because it has remained with me. I have told myself for 20 years that what I did for Margaret. This was Sir Alister's wife, Evelyn's mother, who had died some 8 years after her husband's death, the slow accumulative illness of a woman whose grief had never been properly resolved. I am no longer certain, looking back, whether I protected her or merely preserved my own capacity to look at myself in the glass each morning. Holmes said nothing to this, which was, I think, the correct response. And after a moment Ames rose and went to find Evelyn. Whatever passed between them in the hour that followed was not witnessed by either Holmes or myself, and is not mine to record. Sir Julian's was on his feet by early afternoon, moving through his house with the tentative deliberateness of a man relearning its proportions after several days of confinement. The bruise on his temple had faded from deep purple toward the greenish yellow of resolution, a change that struck me, perhaps fancifully, as appropriate to the day's general character. He found Holmes and me in the entrance hall as we were preparing for the journey back to Ardale and the southbound train, and he stood before Holmes for a moment with an expression in which gratitude and sorrow were so evenly combined as to produce something that resembled neither. "I am not certain," he said at last, "whether what has happened here has done more good or more harm." Holmes considered this with the seriousness it deserved, which not everyone would have extended to it. "The harm was done 20 years ago," he said, "and has been accumulating interest ever since. What has happened here is merely an accounting. Those are rarely comfortable, but they are generally preferable to the alternative." Sir Julian nodded slowly. He shook Holmes's hand, and then mine, with the firm grip of a man who is returning to himself, stood in the doorway as the carriage came around. The drive to Ardale was quiet, the lane passable now, though bounded on either side by walls of grey-white snow that would stand for some days. Yet, before the thaw completed its work, moors stretched away on all sides, with the flat, indifferent expansiveness that had oppressed me on the journey north, and which I now found, unexpectedly, less oppressive. They were simply what they were, I thought. Large, cold, truthful in their blankness, offering nothing they did not contain. Holmes sat beside me with his coat collar up, and his eyes on the passing landscape in the attitude of a man who has concluded one thing and not yet begun the next. It was not, I knew, vacancy. With Holmes it never was hot. But it was the closest approximation to rest that his nature permitted, and I did not disturb it. It was not until we were settled in the railway carriage, south of Ardale, and moving at speed through a countryside that was still more winter than otherwise, but carried in it the faint promise of something eventual, that he spoke of the case directly for the first time since the previous evening. "The most instructive thing about this affair," he said, to the window rather than to me, "was not the crime. The crime was a common enough structure, avarice and violence, and the attempt to manage the consequences of both. What was instructive was the silence." He turned his head slightly. "3 men of education and position, none of them, without some genuine quality, sustained a mutual concealment for 20 years. Not because any of them was at peace with it, but because each one calculated that the cost of exposure exceeded the cost of continuation. They were all wrong in that calculation, as people invariably are, but they did not know it, so they continued. Silence, Watson, is not a passive thing. It compounds, it requires maintenance, and the effort of maintaining it produces, time, exactly the pressures that ultimately destroy it. I watched the countryside move past the window and thought about Grigg clearing snow in, the kitchen garden, and Ames choosing his words with 20 years of rehearsal behind them, Fenwick's fingers moving for papers that were not there, and Vale watching corridor mirrors with the habit of a man who has never fully stopped expecting to be found. A man's public actions can be falsified, I said, but the private adjustments they require cannot be entirely hidden, not indefinitely. Holmes glanced across with the slight expression that represented, in his vocabulary of response, agreement and the mild satisfaction of a thought well articulated. "You have understood it precisely," he said. "One, the truth of this case was written not in the documents, but in the bodies of the people who had suppressed it, in the gestures, us, they could not stop making, and the rooms they could not stop watching, and the questions they could not stop anticipating." Psst. He settled back in his seat and turned to the window again, and when he spoke next his voice had the quality of a man completing a thought that needs no answer. "Men are misled less often by what they observe than by what they assume must be true. The evidence at Blackmere Hall was plain enough. It required only someone willing to look at what was actually before them, rather than what the arrangement of it was designed to suggest. The train carried us south through the thinning winter afternoon, and the Yorkshire moors gave way by gradual degrees to softer country, and then to the gathering outskirts of the south, by the time London's familiar grey sprawl appeared at the edges of the dark. I had the whole of it arranged in my mind as I have set it down here, from the cream-coloured envelope on the Baker Street salver, to the constable riding up through the clearing snow, and the long silence that had ended, at last, in the only way that long silences can honestly end. I have recorded the case under the title by which I shall always remember it, by which, should these papers find eventual publication, the reader will perhaps understand that the most dangerous kind of burial is not of the dead, but of the truth that attends them, and that the interval between concealment and discovery is never, in the end, secure as those who rely upon it believe.